Hello, Year 10. This is Mr. Azapadi with another video for this dialogues unit, and this is more stuff about medical ethics. So the title is, what are the ethical arguments for and against genetic manipulation? Now, what I'm going to do uh, in this lesson, though, is I'm just going to basically go through the information, and I will put the slides online so that you have all the information that you need. So you don't need to make notes at the beginning. What I want you to do is basically take this information at the end, and you're going to kind of summarize it in a revision sheet at the end that you're going to create. So that's the idea for this lesson. So yeah, if you want to print out the notes that I send out, that'd be great, or just watch the video. You can take notes as you go through, but the main thing I want you to produce is this revision resource at the end. So we're looking at something called genetic manipulation. It's a bit complicated, this, but it should become clear. So genetic manipulation means this: manipulating or altering an organism's DNA for therapeutic reasons. So it's all to do with DNA, the kind of the part of cell that that's within cells of human beings that decide on the makeup of that human being. The DNA is basically the blueprint for what a human being is like. It's a really important thing. When we say for therapeutic reasons, we mean for reasons to do with healing. Therapeutic just means to do with healing. So in other words, somehow manipulating or changing or altering an organism's, and we mean a human being's here, DNA, for therapeutic reasons. In other words, to solve health problems or to overcome some kind of health problem. So I'm going to look at 3 examples. That might not have been that clear, but when I look at the examples, they should be more clear what's involved. In one case, I mean, it's kind of strange because actually genetic manipulation is not, it sounds like you're changing someone's DNA, but we're not really changing DNA. In the examples we're going to look at, in 2 cases we're just selecting embryos that have a particular DNA that people want, and in another case we're taking DNA out of one cell and creating basically a clone using that DNA. But let's go through and look at the examples so it's nice and clear. So the first example we're going to look is something called therapeutic cloning. Now, what happens in therapeutic cloning is this. Well, basically what I should say is we're going to go through these different examples, and we're going to look at, for each one, we're going to look at what it is, and then we're going to look at what Christians think about it, whether it's a good or bad thing. Because this is not stuff that was around at the time of the Bible, so it's difficult for Christians to make decisions about this stuff. But it's stuff that raises important ethical questions, and therefore Christians have thought about it. So let's start with this, therapeutic cloning. So in therapeutic cloning, what happens is someone is ill or has some health condition that means that they need the creation of certain cells in their body, but they're unable to produce those cells. So they need certain cells, but they can't produce those cells themselves. So some part of their body is damaged in some way. And one thing that the body does well usually is to produce cells to mean that they can heal that part of the body, but sometimes that's not possible. So it's a situation where you need certain cells of a certain type part of your body. So what you do in this situation is you take a cell from a patient, just a cell from that patient, and then you take the nucleus, the part that's inside the cell, out of the cell, and the nucleus is the part that contains the DNA. Then what you do is you take an egg from a woman and place the nucleus in that egg. So you put the DNA of that person in this egg, and then that egg is stimulated to grow. This is outside the womb. So like the way that IVF works. So the nucleus is put into the egg now contains the DNA of that person, and the egg is stimulated to grow. Now, the embryo that is created by putting the nucleus in the egg and having it grow, it creates an embryo. So that could grow into a human being. And the embryo contains what's called stem cells. Now, those stem cells, because they've got the DNA of the person who's ill in them, they will be a genetic match for that person. So there'll be stem cells that you'll be able to be a genetic match for the person who's ill. The reason stem cells are really important is because stem cells can be used to grow into any other type of cell in the body. So basically, because when an embryo is first created, at the beginning, it's only got a certain amount of cells. So in order to create all the different cells in a human body, an embryo has to have this thing called stem cells, which can be used to create can be grown into any type of cell. That's how we get all the different cells that we have in our body. The problem is that as we get older, we lose that ability to create all the different cells in our body, because we just have all the different kinds of cells in the different parts of our body. So we don't have those stem cells anymore. So what they do, what they can do then is they can take the stem cells from that embryo and use them to create cells, which then they can then place into the adult person who the DNA comes from. So say someone has got muscle damage. I don't know, this is just an example. They've got muscle damage and they need to create some muscle cells to repair that muscle damage, and they can't do it. They can take the stem cells from this embryo they've created, and they can grow muscle cells from those stem cells and replace them into the body. Or you might have some damage to part of the brain, and so in that case they could take stem cells from the embryos they create and grow them in a way that they can become cells in the brain, and they can replace cells in the brain. Now there's this is still at its early stages, therapeutic cloning and the use of stem cells. So it's not completely clear what benefit it can be of, but there does seem to be great potential in this to heal many illnesses or conditions which could not be healed in any other way. Obviously, one of the problems is that those embryos that you create, when you get the stem cells from them, in the process of getting the stem cells from them, you destroy the embryo. So you are destroying those embryos that you can create. So you can probably see already how this is quite difficult for some Christians. Now, therapeutic cloning is legal in the UK. You are allowed to create these embryos, put the DNA into the egg and grow the embryo, as long as the embryos don't grow to more than 14 days. The idea there is that after 14 days, the idea would be that after that point, the embryo has more moral significance, that somehow it's worse to take the life of an embryo that's 14 days old, whereas if you destroy it before 14 days, they think it's better, that's less problematic. So that's the idea. So they want to basically destroy it before it becomes significantly big, where it's still, while it's still what most people would see as just a blob of cells, rather than becoming near to being a living being. That's the idea. Look, here's a picture to give you a sense of how it works. So look, at the top right, you've got an egg from a human donor. Then the nucleus so the egg has a nucleus, that is removed, that's taken out. And then you get, at the bottom left, you've got a nucleus is removed from the patient's cell, from the person who's ill, and that nucleus is put into the egg. Then they do something in the laboratory, I don't know what they do, to stimulate the egg to divide and start to grow. So it develops into an embryo that could become a human being. But after 4 to 5 days, the stem cells are removed. Stem cells from the embryo are cultured for therapeutic use, so they grow them into whatever cells they need. That is how it works. Here's some evidence that it might be a useful thing. So it says therapeutic cloning used to treat brain disease. Therapeutic cloning, in mice at least, therapeutic cloning works in mice at least. This is a news story from 2008. An international team has restored mice with a condition similar to Parkinson's disease back to health, using neurons grown in a lab that were made from their own cloned skin cells. So they took the cells from the mice, they created embryos using them, and then they used the stem cells to cure a condition with the mice's brain. This is the first time that a disease has been successfully treated using cloned cells that had been derived from the recipient animal. It is a proof of concept, said Lorenzo Studer of the Sloan Kettering Institute in New York, US, who led the research. But he warned it's too early to say whether this technique can be developed into a practical therapy for human patients. But look, the potential is there to use stem cells to, Parkinson's is a hugely big problem. Many older people suffer from it, and causes great problems for their a great deal of problem and hardship, reduces quality of life. So this is something that can be used to solve that problem. Okay, so for each one, we're going to look at the arguments against it, why some people would be against it, then why some people might be for it. So Roman Catholics believe in the sanctity of life based on natural moral law, because one of our purposes is to preserve life. They also think that an embryo that is created in therapeutic cloning is a living being, since life begins at conception. So as soon as the embryo is fertilized, and it's fertilized by putting the DNA in there and it starts to grow, that's a living being for Catholics. So they would say, no, you can't do this because this involves killing a living being. Many conservative Protestants tend to agree that life begins at conception and that therefore destroying the embryos is wrong. They wouldn't base this on natural moral law, but on Bible teachings. For example, thou shalt not kill. If the embryo is a living being, they'd say it's wrong to kill it. Liberal Protestants are less likely to believe that life begins at the point of conception. So liberal Protestants tend, not always, but often a liberal Protestant will have a more flexible idea about when life begins. That they might take the point, the point where the child can feel pain or something like that. Different points that are given, but they're less likely to stick with the idea that life begins at the point of conception. In addition, using the theory of situation ethics, they may argue that as it can bring a great health benefits to people who are already alive, using therapeutic cloning could be the right thing to do in some circumstances. So remember, situation ethics is based on love your neighbor, do whatever the most loving thing is, and they would say, well, if it's going to provide a cure for something like Parkinson's disease, maybe it is the most loving thing. Not a Christian point of view, but similar arguments could be made by utilitarians based on the idea that it brings the greatest happiness to the greatest number of people. For utilitarians, destroying a less than 14-day-old embryo doesn't harm anyone's happiness because that embryo hasn't got any feelings yet, so it's not taken into account. But it can certainly, if stem cells are taken and can help living people who are already alive, it will certainly increase their happiness and the happiness of their family. Okay, next one, designer babies. So, yeah, designer babies, because we're talking about genetic modification, it's not quite true that designer babies is not where you get a baby and you change its DNA. Instead, it means a situation when children are created using IVF and then screened in order to check they have particular characteristics. This then influences the choice about whether to select that particular embryo to implant in the mother's womb. It has been used in the past to check whether a child has certain inherited disorders, and this is legal. So there might be some inherited diseases or disorders that are passed down to the family, health problems that you genetically inherit from your parents, or you can genetically inherit. So the idea would be you create these different embryos and you see, do they have the gene in there for that particular inherited disease? If they do, you don't implant them. You only implant the ones that don't have that inherited disease. And a lot of people are very positive about this because it means, some very, very major illnesses or diseases that can affect your life very badly can be avoided through that technique. So that is legal to do. You can scan children for certain diseases and select the embryo based on that. In cases where there's an inherited disease and it only affects one gender, it's also legal to screen for gender in that situation. So it might be that there's something that's passed down by the parents, and it only affects, say, girls or only affects boys. And in that situation, it's legal for the parent to scan. They might think, because if I have a boy, it might have this genetic disease, then I want just to only to have girls. So you're allowed to scan and select for gender there. Now that, obviously, many people would see that as a good thing. You're selecting the child without that disease that would make its life very difficult. But look at the picture. It says, some of these things like no inherited diseases, low risk of Alzheimer's or stroke. Well, maybe that would be something we want to do. But would we want to select to have perfect vision so we could get rid of all people? You never have to have anyone in your family that have bad eyesight. Would it be good to select for high IQ so that everyone in your family is really intelligent? Would it be good to select for athletic skills so you'd pick people who are really good at running or whatever? This seems to raise, so you could screen for beauty, strength, intelligence. This seems to raise more ethical problems, right? Because, yes, okay, there are certain inherited diseases that people wouldn't want to have, but if we start to say, well, we want a child with a certain coloured hair or a certain IQ or something like this, do we risk the situation in which we are valuing certain characteristics over others and saying to certain people that they are not as worthy of other people because of their genetics? I'm quite proud to wear glasses. I don't think I wouldn't want to have been genetically got rid of because I haven't got a perfect vision. It seems offensive to people who are short-sighted to me. But there we go. Let's look at some of the arguments against. The Catholic Church says, this is a quote from a document produced by the Catholic Church, pre-implantation diagnosis, that means screening, is therefore the expression of a eugenic mentality that accepts selective abortion in order to prevent the birth of children affected by various types of anomalies. In other words, eugenic means when it was a sinister thing from the past when people used to think that you should only let certain people breed and only allow certain kinds of people to have children so that you could kind of create only the best or the greatest kind of people. It's got a strong overtones of the word eugenics with racism and different things like this. Discrimination against the disabled, all these kind of things are in that word. So in other words, what they mean is selecting babies with a particular genetic makeup is wrong because it involves devaluing and also killing human beings just because of their DNA. You're basically saying some people are less worthy than others. Think of it from the Catholic Church point of view as well. All of these children you're creating through IVF are living human beings according to them. So you're basically just killing some because you don't like their genetics. Now, I think they'd be against that already with the disease thing, because they'd say, well, okay, this child might have an inherited disease that might suffer from when they're at some stage in their life, but still it's wrong to kill them now. They've still got all their life to live until that happens. But I think Catholics would think it's even worse in cases where you're saying that this person is going to, we're selecting because of hair colour or gender or intelligence. You're basically saying that people of low intelligence or people with the wrong hair colour or whatever don't deserve to be alive. Some other Christians would argue that children must be treated as a gift from God and not as a consumer commodity that we can pick and choose based on our own personal preferences. So for Christians, when people have children, that is a gift from God. It's up to God. God has given that gift to you and you accept that gift. You don't pick and choose. You don't say, I want this kind of child, I want that kind of child. Even Christians who accept designer babies, when the aim is to prevent disease or illness, may not accept screening for gender, intelligence or good looks, as this seems to undermine the idea that all humans are created in the image of God. To Christians, all human beings are special and valuable. It shouldn't make any difference. Looks, gender, intelligence, all that kind of stuff. Why might some people be for designer babies? Well, Christians who do not believe that life begins at conception, the fact that multiple embryos are created and destroyed does not pose a problem, as this would not be seen as taking human life. That would be not seen as the same as taking human life. So yeah, for some liberal Christians, this wouldn't be a big problem because you're not taking a human life. Also, if the process only happens to prevent diseases, many Christians would accept this as a way of following the example of Jesus. Jesus heals people in the Bible. Healing is a huge part of what he does with his miraculous powers. But this isn't using miracles, but it is a way of, obviously Jesus thought it was a good idea to heal people who are ill. So if you're preventing disease through the process of designer babies, some Christians would say, yeah, that's a good thing. Okay, last one. Saviour siblings, very closely linked to the idea of designer babies because the process is similar. So a saviour sibling is a child who is born in order to provide an organ or cell transplant to a sibling who is suffering from an illness. So one child has been born in the family already. They're suffering from some kind of illness and they need, in order to overcome that illness, whether that is in order to survive, it could be to keep them alive, or it could just be to increase their quality of life. If they've got some illness that brings them a very bad quality of life, then they might need a donor. But the problem with donors is it's not always possible just to have any old donor. You need a donor who's going to be a good genetic match. And the best way to get a proper genetic match is to have a sibling who is a strong genetic match for the child who's already alive. Now, what they do then is they, like in Designer Babies, they create many embryos using IVF, using the sperm and the egg of the mother and father, and then they screen those embryos to see how good a genetic match are. The ones that are the best genetic match are then implanted back into the womb of the mother. The mother then gives birth, and then you've got a child there who can be a donor to help their sibling. This raises some really interesting questions. There's this film, My Sister's Keeper, which is all about that situation of save your sibling. Quite an interesting film, and it's something we looked at in year 9, and it raises lots of ethical questions. Let's look at the for and against on this. So, kind of straightforwardly, we're going back to the same message again and again. Sometimes screening and selecting which embryo to implant will result in some embryos being destroyed. So as we've said already, Catholics, because of the natural moral law and the idea of preserving life, and many conservative Protestants, because of thou shalt not kill, think that you can't just screen and just destroy the other embryos and only select the ones you want, because that's taking human life. You're killing those embryos. In addition to that argument, some Christians also argue that it's unfair to create a child as a means to an end. When you doing something as a means to an end means that you do that thing not for the thing itself, but for the sake of something else. So, in other words, what would say the normal way to say it would be that the child is being used. The child is being born not because it's being valued for its own sake, but because because it can help someone else. Now, there's lots of different ways to think about this, why that would be wrong. You could say, well, it will have a negative effect on the child psychologically. The child might not feel that it's wanted for itself. It might feel, oh, I've just been born in order to benefit someone else. I'm not really wanted, so it could harm the child psychologically. It could be seen as going against the teaching of love your neighbour. It could be saying that, well, actually, you're not treating that particular being in a loving way. You're treating that being as just something to just use to get you this other benefit. It could also be seen as going against the teaching that all humans were made in the image of God, because that teaching seems to suggest that everybody should be treated as special in God's eyes. Everybody should be treated as equally valuable to God, whereas it could be argued that the creation of saviour siblings might be a way you might suggest that you're not giving as much importance to the sibling who's being born as to the sibling who needs the donation. Now, you can argue against all those things. Some people might say, well, what if the parents were going to have another child anyway? If they're going to have another child anyway, why not just do it through IVF and select a child that can be a saviour sibling? Because that way it kind of you're going to have a child anyway, and you get the benefit of helping the child who's already alive. But these are some arguments that you might see from Christians. What about the arguments for? Well, some Christians who believe in the sanctity of life, if they believe that life is sacred, all life is sacred, then they might see it's a good thing to have a saviour sibling because it can save a life. Obviously, that's going to be balanced, though, because if you think that life begins at conception, then you're throwing away a lot of embryos. So there's a balance here. I suppose that argument that you'd say sanctity of life is important, so saviour siblings are good if they save the life of the sibling who's already alive, would only work if you didn't believe that life begins at conception. And that's possible. You can believe in sanctity of life and believe that life begins at some time after conception. That is possible. Some Christians don't think. In fact, there are some Christians who have that idea of the 14-day limit. Some Christians agree with the idea that we shouldn't treat embryos as living beings until 14 days, which goes along with the law. So you might say, I believe in sanctity of life, but I don't believe that embryos up to 14 days are actually alive. Therefore, there's nothing wrong with creating a saviour sibling, and in fact, it's good to create a saviour sibling because it might save the life of an actual living being. We've said this before. In the Bible, Jesus often heals the sick. To some, this means that Christians should follow this example and heal people whenever they can. Allowing saviour siblings is one way to help to heal the sick. Lastly, many conservative Protestants follow the teaching of love your neighbour. Now, we've already seen that for some people might interpret love your neighbour as meaning save your siblings is wrong because you're not treating the child who's born in a loving way. But others might say, well, actually, it is right because we're treating the child who's actually alive and needs a donation in a loving way. That's the thing about love your neighbour, is that it's often quite vague and it's hard to decide what the most loving thing to do in each situation is. So liberal Protestants could disagree about that. Okay, so now it's over to you. This is your task for today. I want you to create a revision resource, maybe an A4 sheet of paper would be the best way to do it, but you can present it in any way you want. Make it, visually nice and bright and with your evidence bit standing out, any quotes you use highlighted, whatever you want to do like that to make it look good. And the idea is that you need the basic information for this thing. And the basics that you need are this. You need to be able to explain to me the 3 kinds of genetic modification. What are they? The first one is hard to explain, therapeutic cloning. So you've really got to make sure you've got as neat and clear an explanation as possible. What is therapeutic cloning? What are designer babies? What are save your siblings? In the process of explaining them, you've got to be able to explain what they're for. So how does therapeutic cloning help people? How does designer babies help? Why would someone want designer baby? What's a save your sibling for? Then you need at least one Christian argument for and against each one. So at least one for and against designer babies, at least one for and against save your siblings, at least one for and against therapeutic cloning. And, put some kind of picture in to represent each one. So have some kind of picture for therapeutic cloning, whatever it is, whether it's the DNA strands or the egg with the DNA replaced in. Designer babies, I'm sure you can think of something to draw for that. Maybe a baby with the word Gucci written on its head or something. And then save your siblings, however you want to do it. Some kind of picture, so it's visually striking. So when you look at it, you can say, I remember what that is. That picture meant therapeutic cloning. Then you can say to yourself, without looking at the rest of the writing, you can think to yourself, what is therapeutic cloning? Then you can remember it. Then you can give one argument for, one against. Now, yes, I've given more than one argument for and one against. And yes, you can put more than one for and one against in your revision resource. But remember, you're not going to get asked a question about therapeutic cloning directly. You'll get asked a question about genetic modification, and that means that you'll be able to write about any or all of these 3 things. You could do one SEE on each of those, on each one. One about therapeutic cloning, one about save your siblings, one about designer babies. So you don't actually need to have every single argument from this PowerPoint. As long as you can say one thing for and against each one of those 3 things, then you're fine. Okay, thanks guys. I appreciate all the hard work. Hope everything's going well with you guys. Bye.